Welcome to this channel Gain Java Knowledge, and today in this video we will discuss about Spring Boot Transaction Management System, and we'll also discuss what is transaction, and after that we will discuss different types of propagation level supported by Spring Transaction Management System. So okay, let's start. First we will discuss what is transaction. Transaction is a unit of work, means do everything or nothing. So in this example, we will see if we are performing two operations in a single transaction, means we are saving the user details into database and also saving the message details into database. But these are in a single transaction. And after performing the save operation of user, if message service failed, then everything will be rolled back and nothing will be saved into database if we are using transaction. If we are performing this action without transaction, then user information will be saved into database, but message detail will not be saved. So without transaction, it will be saved, but if we are performing inside transaction, then it will roll back, because transaction means do everything or nothing. That is the main principle performed by transaction. Now we will create one Spring Boot project and we'll see how the transaction works. So here I have already created one Spring Boot project, and in this project I have created two controller. One is message controller and second is user controller. So in this example I will show you how the transaction will work and how without transaction this example will work. So first I will open user controller, and in this user controller I have just created one REST endpoint. So this REST endpoint will save the details of user into database and will also save message detail into database. So when I will hit this user endpoint, then user detail and message detail will save into database. So data will goes to database, and here I am using H2 database, that is in memory database. And first I will show you without transaction, and after that I will show you why we need transaction. So here in my pom.xml I have added the dependencies like spring starter data jpa, because here I will use spring data jpa to save the data into database, and this one is starter web, and there is their lambo, so no need to write any setter getter. And here I am using S2 database, so this dependency is related to S2 database, and this one is related to Spring Boot DevTools. So if I will do any changes in our application, then no need to stop the server and run again, it will automatically handle and build the project. So here I will go to user controller, and now I will start this application, and this is the URL that I will hit. So first I will start the application, run as Java application, and here we can see here I am not using any transaction, user service implementation, and this is my service layer, and at my service layer I am not using any transaction. So here we have just used @override annotation, and we also can check at save message, here also not using any transaction. So when I will hit this REST endpoint, both the user and message detail will save into database. So now I will go to database, and our application has started. So first I will open our S2 console database, and here first I will check both tables. There is any record in table. User table is empty. Now I will check message table, and here message is also empty. Now I will hit the REST endpoint and user. So after hitting the REST endpoint, here we can see user and message saved. So now I will go to database and check into message table. There is one record in message table. Now I will check into user table and one record in user table. So everything is saved into database successfully. But sometime there will be some issue in our code. like this. Our message service, our user detail will save into database, but after that our message service will not save the record into database, and it will throw any exception. Due to any exception, it will not save into database. Then what will happen? So now I will refresh this database and this will empty automatically, because we are using Spring Dev Tools dependency that we have seen in our pom.xml. So now I will again check user table. It's empty. And here I will check our message table. This is also empty. Now here our user detail will be saved into database, but after saving the user detail, message service we have declared null. So here it will throw null pointer exception and message detail will not be saved. So if we will check what will happen. So here I will hit and refresh. So here we can see java.lang null pointer exception. Now I will again check into database, message table. There is no record into message table this time. And here I will check user table, and in user table we can see one record is saved. So for this type of requirement we need to perform transaction, because if we want to perform do everything or nothing principle, then we need to go for transaction, because if we are using transaction here, then nothing will be saved into any table if there is any error in the code. So here I will show you with transaction. Here I will go into my service implementation layer, and here I will just use @transactional annotation and transactional annotation, that is javax transaction. So revert it and transaction, and here we need to use Spring Framework transaction annotation. So here I will use Spring Boot transaction annotation. Now I will refresh the database, because we are using DevTools dependency, so it will automatically rebuild the project. No need to stop the server, and refresh the database. So everything will be clear. Each database table will be empty. So here I will hit user empty, and we'll check message table. This will also empty. Now I will hit this REST endpoint. So here it will show java.lang null pointer exception in our user service implementation.save. Now I will go to H2 console, and here I will check message table, that is empty. And now I will check user table, so this will also be empty. And here we can see no record saved into database, because this time we are using transactional annotation. So if any exception will be raised during this transaction, then everything will be rolled back, because we have saved user. After that exception raised, due to this exception, user table is also rolled back and nothing saved into database, that we can see here. So for this purpose we need to use transaction annotation. Now we will discuss about different types of propagation level supported by Spring. So here Spring Boot support different types of propagation. So here by default, if you are not declaring any propagation type, this will be required. So here if you are not declaring any propagation type, then by default it will pick required propagation. So Spring supports 7 types of propagation type. First one is required, and second is sports, third is mandatory, fourth one is require new, and fifth one is not spotted, sixth is never, and seven is nested. So we will perform each propagation level at our transaction. So we will start from required. So here in this example, first I will go to my code level, and here we can see I have created two controller, message controller, and second one is user controller. And inside user controller, first I will make it right and remove this line of code from here, so there is nothing will be error. And in my application dot properties we can check few properties that I am using here to print the logs regarding our transaction. so it will print the logs on console when the new transaction will be committed and created. And this was the property that is related to database. And in this project that we have created, I have created two services. One is user service and second is message service. So first I will use propagation type required in my example and will hit the message service directly, and will also hit the message service from user service layer. So first the request will goes to user service, then it will pass the request to message service, but we will use same transaction in the example. So here what I will do, I will go to required. If the add message is called directly, then it will create its own transaction. Means if we are using propagation level is required, then it will create new transaction if there is no transaction. For example, we are calling message service method. Inside message service we have created one method that is add message, and we are calling this method, and we are using propagation level is required. Then it will create new transaction for this request. But in second example, if first we will hit the user service and then we will pass this request to message service, and if the user service have also using propagation level is required, then in message service no new transaction will created, it will use the already created transaction. But if user service have no transaction, then we are passing the request to message service, and in message service we are using propagation level is required, then the new transaction will be created in message service. So let's see in the code. Here I will go to user service implementation, and in user service we are using propagation level that is required. And now I will go to message service, and in message service here I also am using propagation type required. So on both service layer I am using propagation required on message layer and service layer. So when I will hit this user controller REST endpoint, this will pass the request to this function, and here I have using required, and then it will pass the request to open implementation in the message service. Here we are again using transaction propagation type is required. So in this example only one transaction will be created when this will execute, and in message service it will use the same transaction that created here. So there will be no new transaction created, that we can see here. If the calling message service method has a transaction, then method will use of existing transaction. If the calling message service method does not have any transaction, then the method will create new transaction. So in case of required, the add message method makes use of the calling user service method transaction if it exists, else it will create its own. Now I will hit this REST endpoint and refresh it. So here we will check logs. Now we will see only one transaction will create. So here in logs we can see creating new transaction with name in user service implementation. Only one transaction was created. And next we can see when message object was saved, it has used same transaction and no new transaction created again. So next one was, and second type of propagation level is support. So if we have created message service, and inside message service we have created one method that is add message. So if I will call this message service and there is transaction propagation level is support, then it will not create new transaction. But in user service layer, if I am calling user service layer function and add user service, we have declared transaction type is required, then our new transaction will create here. But at message service we have declared propagation level is support, then it will use already created transaction, it will not create any new transaction. and in this case our propagation level is spot, then it will execute but without transaction. So now I will show you in code. So first I will call message service directly, and on message service I will declare propagation level is sports, and I will directly call to the message service as we can see in the diagram. So first I will call message service directly. Now we are using DevTools, so it will automatically reload, and here I will call REST endpoint, that is message, and message was saved into DB. Now I will go to console and check. So here we can see the transaction, no transaction was created. So creating new transaction, that was created in JP repository sports. So in our service layer there was no transaction created because we are using transaction level at sports on our message service. So now we will execute this example. I will call to the user service, and at user service I will create the transaction, and then our message service will use the same transaction. So there will only one transaction will create. Now I will go to our user service implementation, and here I will use spot propagation level is required, and from this function we are calling message service, and message service we have declared propagation type sports, so it will use only already created transaction and will not create any new transaction. So here I will call REST endpoint, that is user, and here user and message saved. Now I will check my console, and here we can see created new transaction. New transaction was created at user service implementation layer, and now new transaction was created again. So at message service layer it is using same transaction that was created by user service. And the next one is mandatory, and if we are declaring message service and we are using propagation level is mandatory, and we have not created any transaction, and mandatory we are using propagation level, then it will throw exception. So first I will execute this one. I will declare propagation level at our message service implementation, that is mandatory, and we are not creating any transaction, then it will throw exception. So we will check console. First I will clear it, and here I will call message service directly. So here it's throwing exception because propagation level that we are using is mandatory. So we can see here no transaction was created, and it's throwing exception because no existing transaction found for transaction marked with propagation mandatory. So next example that we will execute, if we are using user service and at user service we are using propagation type required, then it will create the transaction and the message service will use same transaction, so there will be no exception. So now I will call the second REST endpoint from message service. Now I will call message service from user service. So here I will call user service, then it will execute message service. So there is no exception was raised. Now we will check here, because at user service the transaction was created new transaction at service layer user service, and there was no exception. And here we can see from user service we are executing message service. This was the save user function that is coming from here. So the request is passing from here to our user service, and from user service it's passing request to message service. So like this it will execute. And now we will check next one, that is fourth one, require new, and it will create every time new transaction if there is any existing transaction or not any existing transaction. It will every time create new transaction. So if I have created message service, and at message service level we are using propagation level require new, and we are hitting to this method, then it will create new transaction. And at service layer, so first we will execute this one and we will check. So I will go to our message service implementation, and here I will use propagation level is require new, and now I will clear the console, and first I will directly hit to the message service and will check what will happen. There will be one transaction will create when I will call message service message. So it will directly goes a request to our message service, and our message service we are using propagation level is new, require new. So here creating new transaction with Spring transaction in message service implementation. So now I will execute second example. If we are calling from user service, and here we are using propagation level required, here one transaction will create, and then this will pass the request to message service, and at message service we are using propagation level is require new, then again their new transaction will create. So in this example two transaction will create. Now I will change, no need to anything change. In our user service we are using propagation type required, and in message service we are using propagation require new. And here I will clear the console and we'll check it again. So here I will go to my browser, and here I will call user service, then it will pass the request to message service. So now I will check it again. So here we can see on the console, so here we can see creating new transaction with name service user service implementation. One transaction was created in user service, and again suspending the current transaction, and after suspending here one new transaction will be created. So here we can see suspending current transaction and creating the new transaction with name sprint transaction message service implementation. So second transaction was again created in message service implementation, but before creating second transaction it was suspended first one that created in user service implementation. So next propagation level, that is not spotted, and in not spotted our propagation level is not spotted, and we are directly calling to the message service, then it does not create any new transaction. For example, if we are declaring here propagation type is not spotted in our message service implementation, then it will not create any transaction, but this function will execute without any transaction. So now I will hit and check the console. Before checking I will clear it. So now I will hit this rest endpoint, and our propagation level is not spotted. Now here message was saved. Now I will check console, and here we can see creating new transaction, but this was in simple JPA repository, but no transaction was created in our service implementation class. So now what I will do next, if the calling message service method has a transaction, then method does not make use of existing transaction, neither does it create its own transaction. It run without transaction. But if the calling message service method does not have any transaction, then the method will create no new transaction and will run without any transaction. Now I will change the transaction level, propagation level here. So I will pass the request to our user service, and in user service I will create one transaction, that is propagation level. Here I will use required, and on message service I will use propagation level is not spotted, so there no new transaction will be created, and this function will execute without any transaction. No new transaction or existing transaction will use here. So if we are using propagation level required, then no new transaction, then transaction will not used here. So now I will call this function from our user service, and we'll check it again. Here only one transaction will be created, and here I will call user function, and we'll go to console and check it. So here we can see one transaction will be created in our user service implementation, because here propagation level is required. And next we can see creating new transaction, that is simple JP repository. And in our message service implementation, it's not using any transaction. This function was executed but without transaction. And the next propagation level, that is never. If we are using propagation level is never, and we are calling the add message directly, then it does not create a new transaction. So in our message service, if I am using propagation level is never, then it will not throw any exception or not create any transaction. It will just execute without any transaction. And here we will check on console, it will not create any transaction, but this function will execute fine, but will not create any transaction. So here we will check, no new transaction was created. The transaction just was created at Hibernate level, that is Hibernate JPA level. So no new transaction created in our service implementation class. So if we are calling message service from our user service, and user service have already created the transaction, then our message service will throw the exception, because our propagation level is never. So we will check it, and we'll see it will throw the exception. In our user service implementation, we are using propagation level is required, and in our message service implementation, we are using never. Now I will hit and we'll check console, it will throw the exception, because our propagation level at message service layer is never. So here I will call user, and here we can see there was an unexpected error transaction, because transaction marked with propagation is never, so nothing will be saved. And the next one is nested, and the nested propagation level is not supported by Hibernate JP. So this all was about propagation level supported by Spring Transaction Management. Okay, thanks for watching this video, and this all was about Spring Boot Transaction Management.